Okay, maybe we should get
Yes.
get started a little bit. And of course, this is, terribly difficult times, given what is happening in the world, and how can we make sense of it, but also what to do about it. And I think that I'm certainly very, very, very concerned, and I'm sure you are. So, but it's very hard to know exactly what one can do. Uh, I did write a kind of a comment, not from the standpoint of Ukraine, because I know very little about Ukraine, but about some of the background, I think, to what happened, in effect, what happened to Russia in the 1990s, and that to some respects, I think some of the serious mistakes that were made in the approach to post-Cold War Russia is now coming back to haunt us, and the humiliation that was visited upon Russia at that time was not a good idea. But that's all in the past, and we're really having to deal with current events and what is happening. My comments, which are on my website, but it's also on a website called Focal, F-O-C-A-A-L. And a colleague of mine, Don Kalb, who is deeply involved in the anthropology and politics of the whole region, has written a sort of a parallel to my commentary to try to fill out what is going on the ground and what things you might. I haven't yet seen his full commentary, but it's supposed to be posted very shortly. So if you want to follow up on that, please do. It's one of these moments where we academics can only do what we academics do, which is try to make sense of things in retrospect and after the fact, without much ability to actually affect things on the ground. But one of the things that struck me very much about, looking at this situation was how mistakes in the past have long-lasting implications, and so avoiding those mistakes in the future is maybe one of the things, positive things that could come out of it, provided, of course, we have some kind of future to think about. And right now, it's very difficult to know what that future might be. But this week, we're looking at the session 4, which is a sort of a sidebar in a way. It was a bit about Marx in Manchester. And the idea of this is to say that, people make theoretical arguments which have the character of universal statements. And as universal statements, they should apply everywhere. But when you trace it back, you find that these universal statements nearly always had their origins in some particular set of experiences. And I think that is just true for me and you as for Marx. And therefore, Marx's universal theory of capital, for such I think it is, rests on certain experiences. And the experiences were, for Marx, rather vicarious. He never went into a factory, as far as I know. But he certainly read huge amounts and was an incorrigible correspondent. So he had a lot of correspondence. But it has always seemed to me that there is a certain, and it's hard to use the word bias, but let me call it bias in Marx's formulations, which arise out of the domination of the Manchester experience in terms of an understanding of what industrialism was about. And as I began by saying, Marx sets up this idea of that the country that is the most developed industrially only shows to the less developed the image of its own future. Well, you can question that. It's not, but at the same time, it really raises the question, well, what's the image of our future, and what would we now say is the most advanced country? Is it the United States? Is it China, or is it some segment like Silicon Valley, or so on? So that then becomes a question of how do we learn about the world in such a way that we can create a universal set of explanations, and this is what Marx is doing. And so I sort of attracted. It's pretty obvious from reading Capital how much Marx relies upon the reports of the factory inspectors and the other public officials in Britain, which is in itself is interesting because it says that the bourgeois state is actually producing a critical knowledge of itself. And I think in some respects, Marx admires this rather about the British state, that it could do this because other states didn't do it. And the amount of information that Marx could get from the factory inspectors' reports and the public health officials' reports and so on was absolutely enormous. And of course, a lot of that information on child labor and the condition of women and what was going on down the mines and what's going on in the factories, that sort of thing, was a pretty devastating portrayal. And there's always this question, which is why would a bourgeois state, which is run by capitalists and landlords, agree to, or why would it produce such information, which was so damning of its what was happening to its own working class? And my own view of that is that, well, this had a lot to do with the class composition of Parliament. And Marx kind of says, well, and he was correct to say that Parliament was dominated by these two interests, the industrial interests and the landed interest, which is the landed aristocracy interests. And in some respects, they were rivals for political power. And the working class, of course, didn't really have the vote. Only property owners had the vote. So it was the propertied classes. So they had votes, but it was very much, sort of tied up in sort of electoral partitioning between the landed aristocracy and the industrial interest. And the landed aristocracy was fairly antagonistic in many ways to the upstarts of the industrial interests. And to the degree that it was complicitous, if you like, in setting up forms of inquiry which would embarrass, if you like, the industrial class. And to some degree, the aristocracy and the aristocrats kind of endeared themselves to many segments of the working class. And we long took the view, up until Margaret Thatcher actually, that the aristocrats were born to rule, and the aristocrats, given that they were not part of the dominant class relation, were therefore an independent juristic kind of configuration within the British state, which was supported by many elements within the working class. So that much of this information, I think, was coming out of that configuration. But then there are other elements too. Obviously, Engels, from his own experience within his family factory and in Manchester, and Engels' book on the condition of the English working class, and Engels' relationship with an Irish woman of peasant extraction, Mary Burns, was very important in terms of the sort of knowledge that could be communicated to Marx in terms of what was going on the ground. So I wanted to draw some attention to this and to raise this question of, well, where does he get his information from? Where is he getting his ideas from? And if he had had ideas from Birmingham or had all of that kind of industrial setup, would capital have read rather differently? And I think the answer is yes, it might well have read rather differently. And I think that we should acknowledge that. But on the other hand, does this mean that Marx's representation of capital in general is so biased that you can't go for it? And I think the answer to that is, my answer to that is no, it's not. That his interpretations rest on this historical basis, but nevertheless, I think they are universal enough to be able to let us understand the dynamics of the capitalist economy in general to this day. So this was the idea of it, and I thought it was useful to throw this into the mix so that we got some sense of the data and the information which Marx was using in the construction of his general theory. So maybe you have some comments on all of this. Some people have sent me some comments, and there are other elements in his experience that I didn't refer to. One of the comments said, why didn't I talk about his writings on slavery and the Civil War? And that was indeed a very important moment. But Marx himself had very little first-hand knowledge of that and relied almost entirely on the kind of newspaper reports of the time. His attitude towards slave labor and what it was about underwent a kind of evolution at various points, and it's rather a complicated kind of story. You find this in Marx, of course, elsewhere. I mentioned directly the kind of his attitude towards the Irish, which was very negative when he first started writing about conditions of industrial life in Manchester, that the Irish immigrants were prepared to live at a lower wage, and therefore they had a negative effect on wages. And so Marx was kind of critical of the Irish. But then after a bit, both he and Engels realized that they needed to turn it the other way around and talk about the emancipation of the Irish from the kinds of conditions which led them to accept certain kinds of standards of living that he needed, that both Marx and Engels needed to adjust their things. So there's actually a very interesting kind of evolution in their approach to the Irish, and there was a bit of an evolution going on in Marx's interpretation of the role of slave labor in the history of capitalism and what it was all about. And it goes from a kind of almost like, well, slave labor is a kind of a nuisance. It gets in the way of the arrival of a true capitalist society based on free wage labor. So there's a little bit of that goes on at a certain point in the analysis. Then later on, you get a rather deeper understanding of the role of slavery and the plantation system and so on in the development of capitalism. But we will probably come back to this a bit later on in a later session. So those are my preliminary remarks. Who wants to raise some issues, make some comments, and so on? Anybody got their hands up to do that? Don't see anybody right now.
I'll ask a question, Professor. I'm curious. I don't know that it's when Marx is bringing in the factory reports and the data, and he's synthesizing a kind of historical materialist. You know, he's bringing together the historically materialist with the theoretical, and that then becomes this way in which he also is able to maybe begin to imagine a future beyond the present that they're in. And this, I'm wondering if that is something that you think of in terms of like being the political, in terms of political economy, because I've read Marx in like being outside of school, in like political organizing type stuff. And in school, I've come across Marx. I've read him in philosophy courses. I've come across him in political science courses and in history courses. And so it seems like there's only one Marx, but his work exists in these sort of is maybe differently situated in different disciplines. And I wonder, like, is there the way that political economy functioned as a framing way of thinking about the world when Marx was writing, is that still existent? Is there a framing, you know what I mean? Like economics is not doing the job anymore, as you point out. Right. So those are kind of my wonderings.
Well, in what sense do you say a framing? I mean, because I think one of the ideas that we can follow here is to say, well, Marx provided a framing to interpret what is going on in the world. Now, one of the purposes of this week's diversion, if you want to call it that, is to say, well, you know, that framing comes out of a certain historical experience. And we might want to take up that framing and then say, how would we adjust that framing in relationship to our own particular experience? Now, if you've been in social movements, and people in social movements have been reading Marx, and I've taught it to social movement people on various occasions, then what you see is that people suddenly, I mean, typically what happens is that people are reading these rather abstract concepts, and then suddenly the light goes bing, and people say, yeah, oh, I understand that. That's like when this happened to me in the factory, and this is how this worked, and blah, 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 blah. So at that point, the abstract theory reconnects to the material world. And I think this is always for me a very interesting question reading Marx. What is going on here that reconnects to the world around me? And I'm limited in that. I don't know what's going on in many parts of the world, and I don't know what's going on in many labor processes, but I have been exposed at various times to various things. I've, you know, been around a Chinese factory and things like that, and looked at what the labor process, what's going on in the labor process. So then it reconnects, and as it reconnects, it reaffirms the nature of the abstract theory. But then there are things in Marx which don't reconnect, you know, and so I see Marxism as an evolving vision of the world, if you like, and it is not. So I would not want. I don't like to read Capital, and I would not like you to read Capital as if it is some sort of you know, religious text that has to be understood and then simply all automatically applied. And some of that goes on within kind of radical circles. But I like to see it as a dialogue going on between, okay, this is how Marx understood the world. Do these things still make sense? And enough of it makes sense to me anyway, for me to say, well, you know, this is a very good framing of the world. Can this framing be kind of improved, understood better? I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of Marx's framing. So part of what I'm trying to do here is to say, okay, what is the framing? What is useful about this framing, and how does it help us understand what is going on around us right now? Then it's an open question. So, but again, Marx's framing was almost entirely based upon accounts in the written word. He wasn't out there sort of going into the factory and sort of, you know, talking closely to individual workers. He was reading what they wrote, you know, and they did have a press at the time, and he was reading the Star or whatever, Morning Star or what it was called. And so he was using those materials, and to the degree that he then created abstractions from those materials. Then the question for us is, are those abstractions, can we see them going on around us right now? And if so, then how would we then approach them politically in terms of how might they be replaced by something different? Okay, who else wants to comment? What, I mean, I'm kind of curious
I had
as
a,
to what you think about the sort of background he was utilizing.
I had a question about something you said in the chapter and last class about how um, because of the different capitalist contexts in different places, we need to have different visions of an emancipatory socialist future. And
Yeah.
I wondered if to you, when you talk about those different socialist futures, if that's more about different tactics in response to the capitalist present, or if it's actually different futures. If emancipation, if the end result actually looks different.
Well, you know, let me go back to one of Marx's famous sayings about saying, look, we're all able to make history, but we cannot make history under conditions of our own choosing. Now, that says that if we're going to create socialism, the raw materials which are available to us to create socialism are existing in the present. Now, those raw materials look very, very different depending upon what part of the world you're in. And if you're in Bangladesh, you've got a set of raw materials which are of a certain sort. If you're in Finland, you've got raw materials of a completely different sort. And I think one of the things that I would suggest, I may be wrong about this, when we talk about socialism, we sometimes talk about as if it is some solid conceptualized project. But I think we probably should be prepared to talk about many socialisms. That is, if the questions are things like having a humane social relations between people and a productive system that is unalienated, if that is our aim, then what that would look like if you started out your day as a Finnish worker versus an indigenous trader in the Amazon or somewhere, those questions look very different. What is possible where you are? And what kind of socialism might you be able to, it might have these very general characteristics, but what would it look like in your particular, coming out of your particular experiential world? So that rather than saying, well, okay, here's my utopian project as what socialism would look like, and we all look the same, we start to say, well, actually, there's likely to be very different socialist solutions to the anti-capitalist project, depending upon the kinds of raw materials and the kinds of possibilities which exist in the here and now. And those things have changed over time. We now face the kind of question of how would a socialist society deal with artificial intelligence, and what would it be used for, and would there be some kind of level of surveillance going on? If not, how would control be exercised, and how would relationships between people be articulated, and so on? So there are those sorts of questions. So I think that, yeah, I mean, my own view, and I don't know what other people kind of think, that if we talk about the possibility of an anti-capitalist alternative, and we call that anti-capitalist alternative socialism, would we expect it to be the same kind of thing going on all over the world? Or would we expect it to be radically different depending upon the history, the culture, the actual level of existing achievement and the like. You know, what would we say? Or would we think, imagine socialism to be run by one world government, having a world government there, which is kind of deciding everything and reallocating on a kind of egalitarian basis and solving the global climate change? I mean, are we thinking about one kind of global governance structure, or are we thinking about a more federated system of different socialisms in different countries? If we accept the proposition that socialism in one country is impossible, if we say that, are we kind of then going to say, well, the only thing that's possible is some unified global governance structure? I don't like that idea. I have to say, I think that while socialism in one country may not be possible, multiple socialisms working together do seem to me to be possible, a federated kind of vision of socialism. And to some degree that matches, by the way, the sort of semi-anarchist vision of somebody like Murray Bookchin, who talked about biocentric municipal socialism, which is kind of a sort of regional setups of certain kinds. So that, I don't know. I mean, I'd be very curious as how people think about this, or if you think about it at all. Where would you go with it? Nobody has any opinion about that?
Well, I wish I could offer solutions. I mean, I think I have questions or concerns because it seems to me that that's a central like tension or conflict in what's possible in a socialist vision for the future. That the material realities in different locations, because of the way that production has been alienated across the globe and dislocated from each other, that the different material realities in different locations is sort of necessitates these different socialisms, if you agree with that view, but also then creates a problem in that how do resources, there has to be some level of organization in order to share resources, because we don't all have all the resources in one place anymore. There's not, or maybe the question is, how can we organize in different localities to sort of bring back local farming practices, for example, or different things that are very basic in the day-to-day needs of people that are going to be necessary once that particular place, disconnects itself from a global system. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's a question that I have when I'm thinking about these different kind of locally specific socialist formations.
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean, just to take what you're saying and make it a little bit sort of concrete. When Marx was writing, the gross domestic product in most countries was determined by activity within the country. Only in certain cases was foreign trade foundational, and a lot of the foreign trade was simply about transfer of monetary assets from one part of the world to the other, transfer of gold, for example. Right now, world trade accounts for something like 30 or 40% of GDP in all the countries of the world, which means what you're saying, the interdependencies which now exist I mean, go into a supermarket and ask where does everything come from, and the interdependencies. You're pretty much around the world, and you're connected to millions of people through the market system. So the market system is obviously a crucial mechanism through which we get our daily sustenance, and global trade is very significant. Now, what this implies is that any socialist future is going to have to make a decision. Okay, are we going to still have that level of global trade, which is connected, of course, to the diversity of products which exist and so on, or are we going to actually carve up the world into bioregions, if you want to call that, and say these regions are going to be relatively self-sufficient, in which case we'll be back in this situation which existed before the current round of globalization got underway, which is to say that, you're going to be dependent upon the conditions which exist in your own bioregion. And if there's a drought in your bioregion, then it's going to be a real problem. Right now, if there's a drought in a bioregion, flows can be organized. So there would have to be some supra-organization that would deal with the whole system of bioregions in such a way that each one would be able to sustain itself. But there would likely be very, very different standards of living between bioregions, depending upon resource and the nature of the production apparatuses and all the rest of it. And are we prepared to countenance that level of inequality in a world socialist society? So yes, there is then this problem we have at this time. This is what I mean by saying we have to kind of look at the sort of framework that Marx set up for thinking about socialism. We have to set it up in such a way that takes account of the current conditions, and then ask ourselves, how would we orchestrate and think about flows of materials which would be supportive, allowing us, everybody in the world, a certain standard of living in terms of access to food grains and access to other forms of raw materials, and what kind of trade relations and how would those trade relations be orchestrated? Would we need a market to do it, or could it be done, by sort of computer programming? And could we organize just-in-time systems, if you want to call it that, for within the bioregion, which is, by the way, quite will be quite feasible given the computer capacities that now exist. I mean, if you take a large corporation and look at its just-in-time structures, there's the supply chains are very intricate and they're very well organized. And there are organizational forms around where supply chains and the rest, which are used to the benefit of capital, and a socialist society might come along and say, okay, we're going to reorganize this to the benefit of people rather than to the benefit of capital. Now, that may be what socialism is about, is taking the actual apparatus that now exists. And there are people who kind of say, well, there's a book out about Walmart socialism, which kind of says, well, envisage the whole world becomes socialist, and the way we would supply it would be by the mechanisms that Walmart uses to, and therefore we can convert the technological apparatuses and skills that exist within that form of society, and redirect it to a different end, which is not profitability of the Walton brothers, but is to the benefit of the whole population. So is that what we would do? Is that what socialism would be about? These are the kinds of questions which I think need to be thought about. But in order to do that, I think we also have to understand the ways in which capital works, because when capital works, it actually orchestrates all of these things around one single objective end, which is the creation of wealth and income for a capitalist class, and that is that. there are various aspects that, some of the experiences Marx lived through, which I didn't deal with in this. Somebody had commented that, the whole question of how Marx handled slavery and what his relationship was to the Civil War in the United States and so on. And that's a complicated story, as I said. And so there are many other things that could be inserted into here, but I thought it might be interesting to sort of talk a little bit about Marx's background and the extraordinary figures there are. Somebody kind of said, who is this Leonard Horner? Well, he was director of the factory inspectors, and he was for about, 20 years. And he produced all of these reports, and it was astonishing. And Marx kind of says, look, okay, here's this guy. He's not a socialist. He doesn't think of it. He just is, a person who's concerned with the living standards of the mass of the people. And the living standards are appalling. And he's out of his way to and it was interesting that when Nassau Senior went to Manchester to learn from the Manchester industrialists how to approach the 10 hours legislation. So he came back and gave this whole account of how the profit was in the last hour. And Marx is kind of saying, well, that's what the industrialists would tell him. And so he learned it from the industrialists, and he came back and then kind of said, well, this is how I should incorporate this in my economics, which he did. And Horner was outraged by this.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But on that, what you were just speaking to, and Michelle's question about the global, like whether or not you would have these smaller regional organizations or this larger, is there any advantage in terms of like de-alienating labor, like to smaller, more local regional organizations where the global mechanisms might free people, technology might free people from the need to work, and then they could find other ways of spending their time, valuably for themselves. But then the smaller, less global approach might allow people to organize, like work. They would have to work, but they would not be alienated, and perhaps they would be more satisfied through that experience.
Well, which would you prefer?
When I've had the privilege of having work that I didn't feel particularly alienated from, and I enjoyed that experience personally.
Yeah. Well, in that case, why not build upon that? I mean, Marx frequently came back to the idea that free time was the most important thing, and so the other path, as you're correctly pointing out, in opposition to the unalienated labor kind of idea, and locale and all of that. The other idea would be, well, if we can organize basic needs so that we only have to work, 1 day a week or something of that kind, and the rest of the time is free time and we can do what we like. That's the other image where we might use artificial intelligence and automation and all these things in such a way as to liberate free time. But Marx is very emphatic about his measure of how socialist you are is about how much free time you have to do whatever you want, which doesn't mean you don't do anything. In fact, you can go off and do all kinds of creative labor, even productive labor. I mean, if you want to grow, food in your backyard or something like that, you can do as much of that as you want, and you get the resources to do it. So free time is very, very important in Marx, but there's a tension between organizing society around the principle of free time and organizing society around the principle of unalienated labor, which I think is kind of an interesting tension. Any other kind of comments?
I have another, but I guess I was just waiting to see if anyone wanted to jump in before.
Come on then. What do you want?
But yeah, kind of, I'm interested in what you were saying about just-in-time production and the I guess point about logistics in this organizational and how might we organize to allocate resources in a way that is that makes it possible to live in more local structures. But I don't know much about it, but I guess I've been introduced to some ideas that are, on one hand, there's a school of thought that thinks that there's really no way to use the mechanisms of capital and these kinds of logistics like just-in-time technology without just producing more, without reproducing the same structure that we're already living under. And then there's kind of a school of thought that says the opposite, that no, we could use these tools to a different end. And so because you touched on, I was curious if you might be able to just say more about that, or if there's maybe anyone else in the class who has something to add in that area.
I actually, if I can add to that question, because when you asked about like how to organize it on a global level, like as federations or like how, one large governing global body, I like couldn't help but think of like, how do we do that, a federation model that's different from like the nation state model? We don't like the nation state model, and also are trying to like, incorporate the things about capital that make it possible where we can share resources and not have to, I don't know, I guess in terms of like, how do you deviate from this particular mode of organizing through the lens of capital?
Well, first off, about the state, I cannot imagine an economy and a world where there were not organizations of governance and administration which would be built to facilitate the kinds of exchanges and social relations and legal structures that will be required for a socialist world to function. So I take that as given. Maybe I shouldn't, but I take that as given. That, however, is very, very different from the capitalist state. I think right now we have a real problem with the capitalist state. And the capitalist state is an organization that does all of those things, but does all of those things around the accumulation of capital and directed towards the accumulation of capital. And so in a sense, I share the kind of antagonism towards state-centric politics. But at the same time, I would want to argue for, well, there have to be administrative structures of governance and governmentality and all the rest of it, which somehow or other are going to help us understand and work with the kind of distribution of goods and services and productive capacity and all the rest of it in a way which is sophisticated. But one of the things that happens is that people get totally against the state. And I'm against the capitalist state because the state now has taken on capitalistic forms. It cannot do anything other than pretty much what it does, which is to support capital accumulation. And almost every time the state steps in to cure the problems for people, it does it in such a way as to support capital. I mean, what did it do in the housing crisis of 2007, 2008? Instead of supporting people and keeping them in their homes, it supported the banks, and it allowed the robbery of basically people's assets in home ownership, and 7 million people or whatever it was, or households lost their housing. And it was all picked up by Blackstone. I mean, in other words, the capitalist state comes up with answers to crises which make matters much worse. And it is doing the same through things like militarization and all the rest of it. So I think there's a real problem with imagining that the capitalist state can be captured by, say, a workers' movement or a social democratic movement and converted to if you like, pro-people uses. I don't think that's possible. And if we could use the Lenin language, at a certain point, that kind of state has to be smashed, as he put it. We have to get rid of that kind of state, but we need to rebuild organizations, assembly structures and configurations and so on. And many elements of this are already around in the world of people coming up with different organizational forms. That we would need a different organizational forms which are going to actually deal with some of the issues, like simply a decentralized anarchist solution doesn't work, because if you add that all up, you would probably make climate change much worse. You need an organizational form which kind of says, well, there are limits to what you can do because of the necessity to roll back climate change and to control climate change, so that or habitat destruction and things of that sort. So we need to build alternatives, and alternatives are already there and already exist to some degree. And I think one of the reasons that people are taking much greater interest these days in indigenous structures of governance and law and so on is to kind of say, look, there are already, as with the Zapatistas and with the Rojava assembly structures and so on, there are many things going on which are about the creation of these alternatives, and they're going on in a mini scale. There's experimentation going on at all sorts of levels around these questions. But like I say, the idea that we can have an election and the Socialist Party will get command of the state apparatus, and the state apparatus will do the bidding of the people as opposed to do the bidding of capital, no way. I think we have enough experience now to know that is not going to happen, and that therefore we need to rebuild social organizations, and they can be federal and they federated and things of that kind. So that would be my view. I mean, but that's just me taking my position, and I imagine lots of people would have quite different positions. Any other kind of commenters? Okay, well, if they're not, then I'm going to go into the lecture form. Here's the lecture, which is session 5. And session 5 is returning to the main story, as it were, and after this deviation in terms of, okay, where did Marx get his information from, to a very key theoretical question, which is on the question of the rate and the mass of profit and the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Okay, so session 5 goes like this. Any increase in the productivity of labor implies that each individual laborer will be able to process more raw materials and means of production. This means that the ratio of constant capital to variable capital, called the organic composition of capital, will therefore tend to rise, that more and more raw materials will be taken up by labor. If the rate of exploitation of labor capacity, that is the ratio S over V, surplus value over variable capital, remains constant, then the rate of profit, the ratio of S over C plus V, is bound to fall. But the social form of relative surplus value means that the rate of exploitation of labor capacity, S over V, will tend to rise, which may to some degree counteract the tendency for the profit rate to fall. In other words, you've got a double movement. On the other hand, fewer laborers will be employed if the amount of a commodity required in the market remains constant and the productivity of labor is rising. If labor is the source of all value and surplus value, then both will decline if fewer laborers are employed at a given rate of exploitation. This accelerates the tendency for the rate of profit to fall, though by how much will depend upon a variety of contingent and counteracting factors, which we will take up later. This law or tendency has often been referred to, citing Marx, as the most important law of political economy, the falling rate of profit law. Since it is undisputed, the search for and the appropriation of profit is one of the key driving forces behind the history of capital, then this has led to the view that the tendency towards a falling rate of profit is a primary law of motion within a capitalist mode of production. It is often cited as the unique law that underpins the production of all crises. The influential, brilliant, and indefatigable Marxist blogger Michael Roberts, for example, considers it irrefutable that the law of falling profitability is the single underlying cause of the crisis tendencies of capitalism. Nothing, he says, gets produced unless it yields a profit. All alternative explanations of crises, and I quote him, such as the inability to absorb the surplus, underconsumption, disproportion, financial fragility, etc., remain unconvincing and unproven in comparison to the law of the falling rate of profit. Robert's argument, and you might go to his website, he has a very, very good blog which deals with a lot of issues, and a couple of the blogs are dedicated to criticizing my position on the falling rate of profit. If you get interested, you can find about it there. Robert's argument does not fit at all with the concept of capital as an organic ecosystemic totality comprising different circulatory systems, which is the whole idea that I set up at the beginning of these classes. The dialectical and relational approach to capital is one in which each of the individual moments, such as production and realization, internalizes the other within the totality. Each moment is inside of the others. Together, the different moments co-constitute one another within the totality. It is impossible to conceive of production without consumption. It's impossible to conceive of production without realization, exchange, and distribution. It is impossible, therefore, to isolate any one moment as the sole or true locus of crisis formation. The difference between Roberts and I might appear reconcilable, but this is only by resorting to the tautologies and identities of bourgeois economics that Marx criticized in his introduction to the Grundrisse. In a circulatory system, everything at some point runs into or touches upon everything else. A falling rate of profit can, for example, result from underconsumption, but underconsumption can also be due to a failure to invest in response to falling profits. Falling profits can also appear to result from inability to absorb surpluses, from overaccumulation, from failure to cope with disproportionalities, or because of labor or raw material shortages. And I go back here to the analogy with the human body. All human deaths, for example, could technically be attributed to cardiac arrest because the heart invariably stops beating. But it makes no sense to consult a cardiologist when faced with lung cancer. The heart-lung relation is one constitutive relation within the totality of the human body. And it is only in this context that this relation makes sense. It is not as if we can pick up a heart over here and a lung over there and put them together to make a living entity. The fact that everything that occurs in the circulatory system of capital at some point touches upon the profit rate does not justify identifying that moment as the only relevant moment within that totality. Nor is it true to say that nothing is produced under capitalism unless it can make a profit. A lot of production is undertaken by the state and other institutions without regard to surplus value generation. If each moment is seen as autonomous and independent but subsumed within the totality of the circulation of capital, then the problem is to figure out where within this particular configuration of moments under consumption, overaccumulation, scarcities in nature, etc., blockages might occur which trigger, exaggerate, or ameliorate crisis tendencies. When a crisis originates in real estate markets, as it did in 2007-2008, the presumption that this must be a manifestation of the tendency for the profit rate to fall is not particularly helpful. To be sure, at some point, the average profit rate is bound to be affected by whatever else is going on within the totality, e.g. a general strike of labor or demographic constraints to labor supply. But such an effect is a secondary or collateral effect of problems that originate elsewhere, e.g. in the labor market. How the rate and mass of profit relate is, however, an intriguing question. The issue of rate versus mass crops up all over the place. For example, a recent detailed study by the Bank of England of the impacts of quantitative easing upon wealth distribution in Britain estimated that the 10% of least wealthy households saw a marginal increase in their measured real wealth of around £3,000 between 2006-8 and 2012-14, compared to 350,000 for the wealthiest 10%. So the bottom 10% got £3,000 extra, the top 10% got £350,000. This seemed to confirm the popular view that central bank quantitative easing benefited the wealthy more than it did the least well off. But the Bank of England report came to the opposite conclusion. Quantitative easing reduced UK wealth inequality, said the Financial Times headline. The £3,000 received by the least well off was proportionately more, given their initial average wealth, than the £350,000 received by the wealthiest 10%. So quantitative easing could be considered more beneficial to the lowest 10%. But see what this means. £3,000 over 6 years is less than £10 a week, which hardly adds anything to a person's well-being, let alone political and economic power. It is a trivial gain. The wealthiest 10% in Britain got more than £1,000 a week from quantitative easing. Over 6 years, the difference between the lowest and the highest 10% was that of a few extra cups of coffee a week for the lowest 10%, or having enough money to buy a studio apartment in Midtown Manhattan for the top 10%. Yet the poor were judged to have gained proportionately more than the rich. This same problem arose in the Financial Times in interpreting the import of stumbling growth rates in China. After 2009 and prior to the pandemic, that country contributed more than a third of the global growth, more than North America, Europe, and Japan combined. China, in effect, saved global capitalism from a major depression by its expansionist policies during those years. We will examine how later. Any slackening in China's rate of growth would then appear to threaten global recession. Now, it was, of course, recognized that the double-digit growth rates that were the norm during the 1990s could not be sustained indefinitely. But the prospect that China's growth rate might descend to the dismal levels of Europe or Japan, or even go much below 6%, sent fearful shivers through global stock markets in 2018. This data about China's growth rate was really strongly discussed at the time. But the Chinese authorities appeared relatively unconcerned. It took an article by Tom Mitchell, writing in the Financial Times in 2019, to explain why it was so, and it had to do with the role of the mass. And I quote from it, "A bigger but slower growing economy creates more additional demand than a smaller economy that is expanding more rapidly. Last year, 2018, China's economy expanded by about $1.2 trillion, or twice what it did when it was growing at a double-digit rates more than a decade earlier. This creates enough extra urban employment 10 million or more new jobs a year, to ease official concerns about their greatest fear, social instability, and any loosening of their ever tighter grip on China's body politic. If the policy objective is to create 10 million jobs, then it is easier to do so with a slow rate of growth on a large mass, such as that of China's economy in 2018, than through a high rate of growth on a smaller mass, such as that of China in 2000. The rate in itself does not tell us very much about the distribution of benefits without knowing to what mass it is applied. The rate of profit by itself is one of the most popular metrics of how successful capitalists have been in accomplishing their mission. Articles on the tendency for the rate of profit to fall abound within the Marxist tradition. Extensive empirical documentation of the tendency exists. The same care and precision has not been applied, however, to studying the role and significance of the rising mass. The question is, why? The problem initially arose with Engels' editing of the manuscripts that form the basis of the third volume of Capital, where the falling rate of profit is articulated. Engels, it is now pretty much agreed, made it seem as if Marx was far closer to a final version of his argument on the falling rate of profit than was actually the case. The original notes, which we can now read in English, form one single text entitled The Law of the Tendential Fall in the General Rate of Profit. Engels divided the single text into three chapters: the law itself, counteracting factors, and development of the law's internal contradictions. The titles of these last two chapters are hard to justify from the original text. They also make it seem as if the law is a primary and all-important standalone finding, while the counteracting factors and internal contradictions are mere modifications to the fundamental law as it operates in practice. The original notebooks read very differently. The work appears preliminary and explorative rather than definitive. To be sure, Marx begins his manuscript with a clear, crisp, and forceful explanation of how and why the profit rate might fall. The competitive search for technological advantage removes labor, the source of value and surplus value, from production. Less labor input means, all other things remaining equal, less surplus value, which translates into a falling rate of profit. This argument is modified by the fact that the immense increase of productivity that occurred within the British cotton industry with a shift to power loom weaving did not diminish the number of factory laborers employed. The census of 1861 showed 642,000 workers in the industry, compared to far fewer in earlier years. The dramatic rise in productivity reduced the price of cotton goods, which allowed the market for cheap cotton goods to expand dramatically worldwide, to be sure at the expense of domestic handloom and weaving everywhere, but also to meet a rising demand from an increasing population. There was no effect of falling profits within the British factory sector for much of the 19th century. The same could be said more recently of the labor-intensive textile and clothing sectors in China and Bangladesh. In the British case in Marx's time, as I mentioned last time, it was, of course, the Indian market, which was terribly, terribly important, and the destruction of the handloom weaving in India through imperial administration. Marx was not alone in predicting a tendency for profit rates to fall. Ricardo, and more tentatively Smith, also thought profits were doomed to fall, suggesting that industrial capitalism might not be a viable mode of production in the long run. Scarcity is in nature, a Malthusian explanation. Rising land rents and rising wages to cover the rising cost of food would subject industrial capital to an increasing profit squeeze that would ultimately make the industrial form of capitalism impossible. Marx concluded that Ricardo and Smith were right about the outcome, but wrong about the mechanism. Marx held that the progressive tendency for the general rate of profit to fall is simply the expression peculiar to the capitalist mode of production of the progressive development of the social productivity of labor. That's a very, very important sentence. I read it to you again. The progressive tendency for the general rate of profit to fall is simply the expression peculiar to the capitalist mode of production of the progressive development of the social productivity of labor. In other words, the search for relative surplus value and technological advantage created this result. The competitive drive for technological advantage on the part of an individual capitalist would undermine the aggregate production of surplus value, which was the basis of profit. I want to add something here, which is the tendency, which is important in Marx's analysis. For individual capitalists operating to maximize their own interests, engage in behaviors which actually threaten the reproduction of their class. So individual behaviors then are in contradiction to the needs of class reproduction. But then in this case, a few pages further on, after this statement about progressive tendency being the expression of the rate of profit to fall, a few pages further on, however, Marx writes that despite the enormous decline in the general rate of profit, the number of workers employed by capital, hence the absolute mass of the surplus labor absorbed, appropriated by it, hence the absolute magnitude or mass of the profit produced by it, can therefore grow, and progressively so, despite the progressive fall in the rate of profit. He then adds, this not only can, but must be the case. The shift from can to must is important. The same laws, he goes on to say, produce both a growing absolute mass of profit, which the social capital appropriates, and a falling rate of profit. How then, Marx asks, should we present this double-edged law of a decline in the rate of profit coupled with a simultaneous increase in the absolute mass of profit arising from the same causes? Marx has progressed in this section from a falling rate of profit to a double-edged law of falling rate and rising mass. So how then does he view the relation between rate and mass? In the Grundrisse, Marx works through a variety of numerical examples of the rate-mass relation, showing how capital can continue to grow even as the rate of profit falls. A capital of 100 with a profit of 10% yields a smaller sum than a capital of 1,000 with a profit of 2%. Expressed in general terms, he says, this means that if the profit rate declines for the larger capital, but not in relation to its size, then the gross profit rises, the mass rises, although the rate of profit declines. He then goes on to suggest there are two other possibilities. If the profit rate declines relative to its size, then the gross profit, the mass, remains stationary. If the profit rate declines more than its size increases, then the gross profit of the larger capital decreases relative to the smaller one in proportion as its rate of profit declines. This is a typical Marx tactic of outlining different technical possibilities. It is this, he goes on to say, that is the most important law of modern political economy and the most essential for understanding the most difficult relations. It is the most important law from the historical standpoint. It is a law which, despite its simplicity, has never before been grasped, and even less consciously articulated. And this passage is often cited as if it refers to the theory of the falling rate of profit on its own. But the original text and the referent of this in it indicates that it is the relation between a falling rate and a rising mass that is the most important law. The context would seem to suggest that out of the three combinatorial possibilities, it is the first, that of rising mass and falling rate, which is by far the most interesting and significant. This law operates on the basis of the simple rule that a large capital with a lower rate of profit accumulates more quickly than a small capital with a higher rate of profit. Which would you prefer to have? $100 increasing at 10% or $1 million increasing at 2%? If the mass of value in certain hands is already huge, then that mass continues to expand with potentially monstrous consequences, environmental as well as social, even in the face of sharply falling profitability. In today's world, for example, it is relevant to ask whether the main problems we face, such as climate change and increasing inequality, are due more to the falling rate alone or to the ever-rising mass of profit resting on a declining rate. It is also relevant to ask if there are other mechanisms, such as mergers and acquisitions and accumulation by dispossession, that accelerate and augment the coming together of the mass, other than by the mechanism Marx here describes. Leveraged buyouts spring to mind as convenient ways whereby particular capitalists can gain control over a huge mass on the basis of very little of their own capital input. Furthermore, it is presumed in contemporary presentations of Marx's argument that the profit rate is exclusively tied to the rate of exploitation of labor power in production. But in the US pharmaceutical industry, very little of the monetary profit comes from the exploitation of labor power in production. Most of it comes from extortionate and monopoly pricing in the market, with the connivance of medical insurance companies and captive federal regulators. But this still leaves us with the problem of what exactly is the origin of this double-edged law. When Marx first introduces the figure of the capitalist in the Grundrisse, he observes that it is a law of capital to seek profits and to create surplus labor. But capital can do this only by entering into exchange with the worker and setting necessary labor in motion. This previews his statements in chapter 11 on rates and masses in the first volume of Capital. Here, Marx makes clear that the aim and the objective of the capitalist is to command as much mass of value as possible. That is what capitalists are interested in, the mass of value they can control. And that in the absence of technological and organizational changes, there are two ways of so doing. Increase the rate of exploitation of labor power, or employ more laborers. The ambition to create and employ as much labor as possible rules out the possibility of the profit rate declining more than its size increases. This implies, Marx goes on to argue, population growth as a continuous source of extra labor supply. Production founded on capital requires, and I quote him, the greatest absolute mass of necessary and surplus labor, and hence maximum growth of population of living labor capacities. This relation between capital accumulation and population growth throughout the historical geography of capitalism is rarely taken up seriously in the literature. Historically, the association has been very strong. The exponential growth of capital has paralleled the exponential growth of capital since the exponential growth of population has paralleled the exponential growth of capital since the middle of the 18th century until recently. Today, this poses a potential problem because we are witnessing accelerating population declines in some 50 or so states like Japan and Italy, and the pandemic appears to have made matters much worse. How will exponential capital accumulation continue in the absence of strong population growth to feed labor supply and expanding consumer demand? It is also worth noting that countries with weak demographics like Italy and Japan have not performed well in the global competition to accumulate. When Angela Merkel opened the door to nearly 1 million Syrian refugees in 2019, she did so in the hope that the benefits from an increment in labor supply would outweigh the political costs of offending right-wing and nationalist sentiments. She was, unfortunately for her, proven wrong, at least in the short run. And it is very interesting to note that in the current situation of a potential of mass evacuation from Ukraine, that the whole approach of Germany has been much more benevolent towards receiving Ukrainian populations rather than Syrian. The declining rate of profit since the 1970s has been associated with the search for a rising mass of wage labor. The global wage labor force, in fact, increased from around 2 billion in 1980 to nearly 3 billion now, an increase of 1 billion since 1980. This is consistent with Marx's point. The mass of global capital has likewise increased immensely since 1980, even in the face of well-documented falling profit rates. Meanwhile, the share of wages in national product has systematically declined in almost all of the world's major economies, with the United States and China in the lead. This is also consistent with Marx's argument. It is hard to tell what proportion of this increase in the wage labor force is working for capital to produce surplus value, and how much that the wage laborers are exchanging their labor capacity against revenues of the state, of the various factions of capitalist consumers, or even from other workers in the case of childcare or care for the aged. Evidently, much of the increase of wage labor is taken up with informal or precarious employment. Marx at one point did suggest that rapid increases in the productivity of labor would allow for more and more labor to be employed unproductively, providing services to the bourgeoisie, for example. But the social as opposed to individual labor that is mobilized, either directly or indirectly in support of surplus value production, now encompasses more and more millions of workers apparently condemned to ever lower rates of remuneration. This is hardly a description of an economy in a happy state. It may be, as Marx will put it, adequate for capital and for the top 10%, but it produces relative penury for everyone else. But there has at the same time been a strong tendency to reduce necessary labor to a minimum through the application of labor-saving technologies in production. This increasing productivity of labor produces an industrial reserve army, thereby technologically induced unemployment. So while capital on the one hand perpetually seeks to increase the laboring population, it at the same time constantly seeks to reduce labor's presence in production, all the while expanding the unemployed industrial reserve army. This is a major contradiction. Capital operates on a principle somewhat like that the bourgeois economists call a backward bending supply curve. Strange statement, but it's an interesting concept. This curve arises when prices fall. The conventional theory says production should decline until supply and demand converge upon an equilibrium price. But if producers have fixed costs, such as debt service or fixed revenue objectives, then a fall in prices will lead them to produce more to cover their fixed costs. This prompts further falls in price. Conversely, when prices rise, producers may supply less, which results in further price rises. This often happens in raw commodity markets. For example, debt-encumbered soybean producers often seek to increase their output when prices fall in order to meet their debt service. Oil states, to take another very good example, typically have a certain revenue target in mind to fund their functions. So when oil prices decline, they pump more oil, which means lower prices, and vice versa when oil prices are rising. The long-run effects can be sometimes dirt cheap oil for consumers, accompanied by wild swings in both oil prices and oil output. The oil cartel OPEC was founded in response to this problem, with the aim of stabilizing the prices and assuring some stability in oil state revenues. Conservative economists, interestingly, likewise worry that higher wages tempt workers to substitute leisure time for employed work and thereby increase the scarcity of labor, inducing even higher wages. Since this frustrates the achievement of the textbook conditions of harmonious equilibrium in the labor market, wages must, the conservatives argue, be kept low by extra economic means, such as lowering unemployment benefits, to keep their harmonious economic model intact. At the heart of the capitalist mode of production, Marx argues, that there exists something like a backward bending supply curve. A falling rate of profit coexists with an increase of employment of labor that stabilizes, if not increases, the mass of value and surplus value generated for capital. Meanwhile, the competitive search for technologies that increase labor productivity remains intact, making more and more labor redundant. It remains intact, of course, because the coercive laws of competition are pushing technological changes into the labor processes. When technological innovation becomes a business, as Marx suggests it would, Then the production of generic technologies, such as the steam engine, internal combustion engine, electrification, mechanization, digitalization, and artificial intelligence, generalizes the forces making for a falling rate of profit. The mechanism that produces falling profits intensifies, while the thirst to maximize gross profits by employing more labor becomes ever more compelling. The two contradictions are superimposed upon each other. In the absence of any other ameliorating or interventionist force, these two tendencies will produce an astonishing economy, an infinitely expanding mass of surplus value, along with an infinitely disappearing rate of profit. Marx, in his original draft of the theory, presses on to elaborate on some consequential modifications. He outlines a number of potential countervailing influences to counteract the falling rate of profit. There are quite a list of these. These include increasing the rates of labor exploitation, hiring labor at less than its value, the falling value or devaluation of constant capital inputs, the pursuit of wasteful or unproductive investments, and the like. The last of these is of significance, as we shall later see. So widespread and powerful might these influences be that Marx even envisaged phases in which the profit rates might rise, which led Engels in his published version of Volume 3 to add gratuitously the reassuring words that in the long run, we know how the profit rate is bound to fall. One other key influence, which is missing in the 1864 manuscripts, is taken up in the Grundrisse. This is the opening up of new and labor-intensive lines of production. This is vitally important in two respects. Firstly, for many arenas of capitalist production, we witness a typical product development cycle. A new sector, such as car production, comes online, and it is initially labor-intensive. But as the market size and output increases, so innovations that displace labor step by step are introduced. Robotization and automation increasingly remove labor power from production. But this takes several years to accomplish. Secondly, sectors and lines of production are opened up, which are resistant to automation. This process will be taken up later. The contradictions implicit in the rate mass question are central to Marx's analysis. Again and again, he returns to the theme that the expansion of the capital mass can and does proceed apace, even in the face of a declining rate. There is, however, yet another parallel conundrum that needs to be addressed, and we will take this one up next week. One other point of observation that I would make is this. The 1 billion extra laborers that came on into the wage labor force after 1980 had, I think, a certain basis. First was the accession of China to the global economy, and of course the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. That released a vast amount of wage labor into the economy. The second source of labor was the continuing attack upon peasant modes of production throughout Latin America and throughout East and Southeast Asia. And that is not over, but a large labor force was taken from out of the countryside and plunged into the cities after 1980 or so, and that was significant. The third major form was in many countries, more and more women joined the wage labor force, and the feminization of poverty and the feminization of the labor force proceeded apace, and this varies somewhat around the rest of the world. Now, these three sources of increasing labor supply, the extra billion, have effectively been exhausted. We cannot look forward over the next 30 years to another billion of wage laborers coming out. There will be incremental gains. There is still a positive rate of population growth in the world, but labor supply questions are beginning to emerge as serious questions. In China, for example, what we've seen is through the one-child policy is the decreasing availability of wage labor, and in China, that has meant that actually wage rates have started to rise, and the whole dynamics of the economy moved from a situation of labor surplus in the 1980s and 1990s to labor scarcities right now. So what is happening in the global labor market is actually very relevant to this. But the main point here is to say this, that really it is the rising mass, which is, for me, the crucial thing that needs to be looked at in relationship to the falling rate. We have a lot of information on the role of falling rate. What we really need to do is to look very much more carefully at the rising mass. And in Marx's chapter, he starts to talk about it as the necessity of globalization of markets, the problems of underconsumption, the problems of all those things that Michael Roberts rules out start to come into the picture towards the end of that rather important chapter. And if you're going to read volume 3 of Capital, please read it in the original, which is the 1864 manuscripts, rather than Engels' version, because Engels, I think, distorts the story somewhat, and you get a very different impression reading the original manuscript. So with that in mind, we have a few minutes to, anybody wants to raise any questions for clarification in what I'm saying. Any questions? Sometimes people complain that my explanations are not clear enough. Was I clear enough in this explanation?
Can I just ask, maybe it's a bit off topic, but now I'm curious how you find that Engels distorts the story.
Well, when you read the volume 3 that he created, look, Engels did an incredible job in taking these manuscripts and creating volume 3 of Capital. And everybody, all the scholars who've worked on this will agree to that. But he did change some things. And the problem was there were some problems that arose in terms of the original publication of volume 1. And a lot of the time Engels had been saying, well, Marx and Engels have been saying, look, we'll solve all of this in volume 3. So there's great expectation as to how volume 3 was going to solve all of the problems. And this led Engels, when he's taking this manuscript, which is a tentative manuscript, trying to kind of say, well, here's how Marx solved the problems. And the falling rate of profit is one of those chapters. And what Engels did was to kind of say the falling rate of profit is the law. And I see that quoted all of the time. It is the preeminent law. It is the most important law in the whole of political economy. Blah blah blah. So it's constantly being cited in that kind of way. And Engels kind of by saying, okay, there's the law. We write a chapter on the law. We then go to countervailing influences of the law, which is like, well, the foundational law is the law is the foundation. Then there's countervailing influences, which modify the application of the law. And then there's some contradictions within that. So he built it that way. Instead of when you read the thing from beginning to end, it's Marx going through. To begin with, this business of rate and mass is not a countervailing influence. In other words, it was not as if the falling rate of profit has a countervailing influence and the countervailing influence is rising mass. No, they are going on at the same time together. It's not as one is rebutting the other, but you can see why. Capitalists are interested in the mass of value. Intuitively, it doesn't make sense to me to say that all you're concerned about is optimizing the rate and you're not interested in the mass. Of course you're interested in the mass, because the more mass you control, the more powerful you are. And the more the centralization of capital occurs and the more the oligarchy gets power and this kind of stuff. And even in terms of relationships between global economies. Why do we say the United States is a leading economic power? Because it has the most mass. It commands the most mass. Now, if you use purchasing power parity, China has the largest economy in the world, and China is a challenge to the United States because of its mass. And the mass, and it's not because the rate of profit in China is higher or lower or what. My impression from what I learned about Chinese bankers when I was in China was that Chinese bankers don't care about the rate at all. They look at each other and are very interested in the mass. As far as they're concerned, the bigger their business, that's their power. And guess what? Are the 4 largest banks in the world now? Chinese by far. You know, the 5th largest bank is the Japanese, and the 6th largest bank, way, way, way behind, is JP Morgan. I mean, the Chinese are interested in the mass. And actually, of course, there's a very large sector, state sector in China. A lot of the time it produces what is needed and it produces the mass that is required, but with almost zero rate of profit, and they don't care about the rate of profit. So Engels, I think, set things up and actually argued that Marx had the answer. When it's clear when you're reading the original script that this is Marx thinking, you know, like he does, so he sort of, okay, next step. It's not a finished job at all. It's a sort of preliminary excursion into it. But Engels made it seem like it was a very definitive text. And then he adds in these things like he did the one I quoted, where Marx talks about the ways in which the profit rate can actually increase in certain circumstances, and Engels goes on and adds in, but we all know in the long run it's bound to fall. So Engels was committed to this falling rate of profit in a way that Marx was not committed in his original manuscripts, and I think that carried over to how the whole falling rate of profit argument was articulated and then developed and becomes central to a lot of Marxist thinking about political economy. I should make clear that I'm not against the falling rate of profit. I think it's a fantastic argument that Marx makes. I think he's right to move it away from how Ricardo explained it to this explanation. So I'm all in favor of the way that argument about falling rate of profit is set up, and I accept entirely that it is the social expression of rising productivity of labor. I accept all of that. I'm fine with that. What I don't accept is the idea that, well, okay, that's all there is to the story, when actually the first part of this analysis is talking about the rate-mass relation. So to me, the chapter is falling rate of profit, rate-mass relation, then later on countervailing influences, and then some of the internal contradictions, which have to do not with what the problems are within the falling rate, but actually the problems which arise out of the rising mass. And the problems which arise out of the rising mass are, guess what? Where's your market? How are you going to find a market? If you can't find a market, then you go to crisis. And in fact, so the realization problems and Marx. So Marx, the end of that chapter starts to talk about the necessity of creating the world market and expanding the world market, which you have to do if you're going to have an expanding mass. You've got an expanding mass, you've got to dispose of it. And he starts then to talk about the problems of overaccumulation. So by the time you get to the end of the chapter, you're talking about the fact that capital is producing far too much surplus value to be absorbed in the expansion of the markets, and making very clear that there are two kinds of markets. One is the final consumption market, and the other is the market of productive consumption, which is the demand that capitalists make for new plant and equipment and new raw materials as they expand their production. So you know, Marx has I think the original text is very interesting read in that light, and I think you know, like I say, to me the obvious thing is to be interested in the mass, and when Marx kind of says the Grundrisse, what do capitalists want? They want profit. They want the biggest mass of profit they could possibly get, and they have two ways to get it: employ more laborers or improve the productivity of labor. You know, simple argument. And I don't understand why. I mean, people. I've had these arguments with Michael Roberts. His blog is very interesting, by the way. Marx's blog, and he takes up all kinds of contemporary issues, and he's full of data and information. I really like it a lot. But he really has this idea about the falling rate of profit is the only thing that really matters. And he's on record as saying it. So somewhere in one of the blogs, he has a whole argument against me. And so if you want to enjoy yourself, go. Marx is criticizing each other, then you can go off and enjoy that. Marxists love to form circular firing squads. So I'm a part of that. Any other problems, questions? So we're pretty close to the end. So anybody got any other things they want to raise? If not, I'll put this paper on the web, and we can discuss it next time, and we'll take up another topic next time. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.